2. So I want to welcome you to our Wednesday night Bible study here at Madison. So we've been studying prayer. It's kind of hard for me to believe that we've only got a couple weeks left and the quarter will be over. So, but I want to thank you all so much for making, I think, a great class with a lot of discussion, things like that. So what we've been doing is we've kind of been studying different prayers of the Bible. Last week, or the month of October, we're going to hit some topics. Last week we talked about James chapter 5. So this week we're going to talk about what hinders our prayer life and what hinders our prayers. Next week we're going to be talking about how we pray for others. And then we're going to finish up with the class that first Wednesday in November, kind of making a prayer plan of what some things that we can pray for, things like that. So our homework, if you remember your homework, was this whole idea of what might hinder our prayers. Now, what I'm about to, the couple of bullets I'm about to show are not necessarily specific to Madison. In fact, I don't think some of them apply to Madison at all, but they are some of the things you hear about prayer life, right? Oftentimes, you may have people think, well, if prayer is so powerful, then why is it not more important to us, right? Or why do we not covet the prayers of others? Why don't we share things with others so that they could be praying for us? Shouldn't it occupy a greater and more meaningful role in our life? And then why don't we seek out causes and needs for which to pray? So we won't focus on the question. We look at these first couple of bullets, right? Those are some of the things that if you go or you listen to what people talk about prayer, you may hear. Now, I think we're very fortunate here at Madison to have a group of elders who are very much focused on prayer. I know in for me, for example, with my mom, with my sister, and with Dad, we actually met and prayed, right, with one or more of the elders. And so we've had services which have not been but a service of prayer. So, I don't think these necessarily apply here at Madison, although I think sometimes these are questions that we encounter, right? So let's talk a little bit about your prayer life, our prayer life, my prayer life. What do you think, what are some of the hindrances or what are some of the things that may keep us from having an effective prayer life or perhaps the prayer life at a point where we'd want it to be? I'm sure if I ask the question, is anyone satisfied with their current prayer life? I'm sure no one would raise their hand, right? We always see how we can improve, but what are some hindrances to having that prayer life or having the prayer life where you want it to be?
Just too busy.
Too busy, time. We'll talk about that some more in a minute, but it was pre-COVID, so it was the summer of 2019. I taught a class on how to study the Bible. And one of my questions was, what keeps us from having that Bible study or studying the Bible like we should? And the number one answer was time, right? We're too busy. What are some other things that kind of hinder us sometimes from that prayer life that we would like to have?
Sometimes, I know, it's almost like you're afraid to be honest and say what's really going on. Like there's, Lord, help me with this. But there's a whole other level of, Lord, I was selfish there at work today, and please forgive me for that. Help me not be selfish. I was short-tempered with my kids this afternoon. It's almost like we're afraid, and we shouldn't be because God knows it anyway, but it's almost like if we say it, then it, makes it worse or whatever. It doesn't really, but that's one of the things, just fear of honesty.
And it's the same things, right? Sometimes when I was a little younger, I had a lot of trouble with patience. And so it seemed like every time I prayed, it was like, help me be more patient. And so you kind of get to where you're kind of embarrassed because you're praying the same thing or fix the same thing over and over again. Other things.
Kind of on that same note, I think sometimes, or at least for myself, is I just don't want to say. It's like, you want to say something, you just don't know how to articulate it. And he doesn't need that. past that barrier, but it's hard sometimes to just get the right words out.
And I think that's a struggle for all of us, right? To be able to say or don't know what to say.
Well, I think part of our problem too is our actual relationship with God. Feeling his presence or knowing his presence with us and just being able to, and talking about what he said about not knowing what to pray or what to say. You know, sometimes things can be so difficult that all you can do is just fall on your knees and ask God to hold on to you until you can get yourself, you know, kind of in place and, you know, in sync with him. But I think, at least in my experience, it's been until I really felt like I knew God and that he loved me. I mean, you know, just that relationship of knowing that he's there, no matter what, no matter when. You know, now we drive a handicapped car, and sometimes I still have to pray for a spot close enough where I don't have to walk too far. But I mean, I'm just saying, you know, but it's no matter what, just knowing that he's there, whatever you're doing. If it's washing dishes, if it's, you know, cutting the grass or whatever, he's just always there. And I think when we can latch on to that, I think it will help us to be able to express ourselves honestly and, you know, completely.
Others.
I think that it's frustrating sometimes that you don't get an immediate answer. You have to be patient and wait.
Oh, that's a great point, you know, because we live in a world, right? We live in a world where, you know, we have an app and we can put in our food choices and we can go to Sonic and we can say, hey, I'm in this stall, and they bring it to us. So we live in an age where everything's almost instant, right? And then we have patience when we don't. Others, I got a couple written down and we're going to talk about some detail, but have you ever, how many of us, our prayer life really kicks in when things aren't necessarily going well, right? Oftentimes when things are going good, when things are going really well, our prayer life kind of goes on the back burner, and then something happens and it kind of moves to the front, right? Another one that I had was, you know, I remember when I was young, like in my mid-20s, and I remember listening to someone talk about prayer, and they talked about that they spent an hour in prayer. And when I was at that age, I was like, an hour? I can't even get a prayer like past 5 minutes, right? I mean, I think sometimes we get frustrated, we're not patient, or we feel like our prayers should be longer, more prayer life. But I think we also have to keep in mind that, to me, it's just like when we build relationships. We talk about that prayer it should show our relationship to God. Well, you know, oftentimes it takes time for you to build that relationship. And so I think sometimes we compare maybe our prayer life or what we think our prayer life is to someone who's much more mature, who's maybe farther along in their walk, who's got, you know, they've spent the time to see some of that. Sometimes we get discouraged because we don't have the prayer life that we think we should have. But what we're going to talk about tonight is I got 4, and some are related more to our prayer life, and then 2 are related to just prayer in general, to what hinders prayer. Before I start, though, who wants our prayers to be hindered? Satan. I think we go all the way back to the very first class where we talked about the Lord's Prayer. And we talked about how Jesus prayed to deliver us from the evil one, right? And we talked about that we've got to be mindful of Satan. What's the number one reason? And there's a scripture that comes to my mind. What's the number one reason why Satan wants our prayers hindered? What's the Bible tell us about a righteous man? That's right. The prayers of a righteous man, they have power. And so I think Satan wants to make sure that we get hindered, right? So the first one we're going to talk about is this whole idea of time. So my first question for you is, and you can share it, you don't share, but do you have a set time that you pray? Do you have within your schedule, within your day, have you set aside time to where you spend that time in prayer? Or is your prayer life when you have time? I think we've got to, for each of us, it's different. I'm a morning person, so I'm usually up between 5 and 5:30. And so for me, from about 5:30 to about 7, that's kind of my devotional time, meditation time, prayer time. But that's what works best for me, is getting up. My wife is not a morning person, and so I have that time where I have that quiet time. What I find during the day is it just gets too, I can't necessarily set some time in the day. Amy, I'll use her as an example. She's much more late in the day, like closer to bedtime, where she spends that time in that devotional and meditation time. But you got to pick a time. You know, we live in a society where, I don't know about you guys, but I'm driven by my Outlook calendar. Okay. I work for Companies International. I actually have a call tonight with our offices in New Zealand and Australia, right? So if I don't schedule lunch in my Outlook calendar, middle of the afternoon, I'm like, man, I ain't even had a chance to take a break and eat yet, right? So we're driven by that schedule. So we've really got to get into a habit to carve out some time. If your life is hurried, right? If you have a hurried life, it really can easily distract you from time, right? I think it's almost like, I almost treat my time the same way I treat my money, in that if the Bible tells us that our first fruits of our labor should go to our contribution, I almost want my time, pick my time first to do my meditation and my block that off, and then let everything else fill in. But I think it's very important for us to have that time. Let's talk a little about this. Mark 3:20. And then the he here is Jesus, right? Then he went home, and the crowd gathered again so that they could not even eat. You know, we have this picture. Artists will paint this picture of Jesus sitting on a rock with these sheep all around his feet. And it gives us the impression that, you know, he was never pressured. He was never in a hurry. But yet what the scripture tells us is that his life was so busy and hurried that when he went home, he couldn't even eat, right? Everybody wanted something, wanted healing, wanted food after he fed the 5,000. And I think it's very important for us to remember, because when the Bible says that we have a high priest who's been tempted in every way that we have, I sometimes think, well, Jesus wasn't as busy as I am today, right? But I think these scriptures tell us that he had a huge, very busy life. But what we read in Mark 1:35, it says, and rising very early in the morning while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed, right? So what's involved in having a balanced life? What do you think? Discipline, right? How many times have you heard someone say, I wish I had more time during the day, right? We always use that phrase, but the bottom line is that everyone has the same amount of time during the day. And someone who gets things done in that 24-hour period, they may just be, to me, it all kind of comes, I'll probably get, I'm stepping on my toes as well as anybody else's, is it all comes down to what is your priorities, right? And so if you want to have a balanced life, then you've got to make decisions, make priorities. and then have discipline for those, right? And I think that's very important. And so I think that's what we see with Jesus. He made it. Remember, we read when we did the prayer at Gethsemane, it talked about as was his custom. So he made it a habit to do it first thing in the morning, right? What do you think? Well, let's go to the next one. Let's keep on time. To me, the time pressure is not a lack of time, as just some type of distorted sense of priority, right? I used to be a big gamer until I realized that, I would start gaming at 10 p.m. And then when I looked, it was 4 a.m. And I'm like, oh man, I gotta get up in 2 hours to get to work, right? Until it got to where it wound up not quite consuming me, but it wound up to the point where I was totally out of balance, right? Because if I'm going to get early, that's going to be my devotional time, but I do, modern warfare until 4 a.m. and then turn around, I'm getting up at 5. There was a point where I could go with an hour, but not anymore. Right? So I think we really have to focus on this time. And then, and this is where I'm stepping on my toes as well, right? If we use the excuse that there just doesn't seem enough to be enough time to have a good prayer life, if we neglect prayer because it doesn't seem the day doesn't connect enough time, our problem has nothing to do with time, right? Problem has to do with where we set the priority in our life. So how much time a day should we spend in prayer? This is a loaded question, but I don't have a lot of slides, so I'm trying to get some conversation.
I've heard several different answers to this question. Before Paul says pray without ceasing. One technique that I've heard from several people is to actually, with a prayer, and to end that prayer, but just carry that prayer throughout the day. And so you're continually mind as you go throughout the day. And that doesn't mean the whole day is spent in conversation, but it never really leaves your heart. It's never finished.
A great point. And it's 10 minutes from my house to my office is 10, 12 minutes. Sometimes kind of the best prayer I've had, right? I think we don't necessarily I do think we need to have a focused time where we say unto God in prayer. I think if we don't have a focused time, a set time, we just say we'll do it when the opportunity presents itself, that it won't be a high priority. So I think we do have to make sure we set aside time. However, at any time during the day, if there's something on our hearts, if there's something on our minds, we can go to God in prayer, whether it's driving to work, whether it's sitting at our desk at work, whether it's during lunch, whenever, right? Now, those is, when it talks about pray without ceasing, I think that's the time, that's what we got to keep in mind, right? I think I mentioned this, my mom was a huge, she was a big, but she's also a good listener. But, she had 6 sisters. And so she kind of had scheduled for all of them, right? I always talked to her on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. But at any time, I pick up the phone and I call her, right? And we got to remember, it's a relationship. God doesn't necessarily want to say, okay, from this time is my time. Come to him whenever. So I think we need to realize that this, in a way, this is a trick question, because we really should pray without ceasing. And that means some days you find yourself spending a lot of time in prayer. Other days, not as much, right? But I think the important thing is you've got to set some time aside with prayer. And saying that I don't have enough time, then time is not the time that you're struggling with, right? Any other comments before we go to the next one?
In the last passage that you mentioned, Jesus, he was waking up early. Well, he's not waking up. He's been awake all night long, casting these demons out of people, and he's got to be exhausted. And instead of, going off somewhere solitary and crashing, he goes off to somewhere solitary and begins to pray. So I think a lot of times it's even if we don't necessarily like make time, like it should just be the priority. Like it should come before the sleep. It should come before the meal. It should come, in whatever time you have available.
That's a great point. Good point. All right. So let's talk about our relationship with others. So if we look at Luke 18, 10 through 14, we know it's between the Pharisee and the tax collector, right? But real quick, Luke 18, beginning with verse 10. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself would be exalted. So, do you think how does our relationship with others, or could our relationship with others, hinder our prayers?
We had the example of Christ saying, if you realize your brother has something against you, don't even take your gift to the altar, just set it aside and go first rectify that relationship, and then you can go and worship. I think the same would be true of prayer.
And that's actually on the next slide, Vic, but yes.
Well, 1 Peter 3 also calls out husbands and says, how you treat your wife is going to affect your prayers. Your prayers will be hindered if you aren't treating her in the way that God would have you to.
So I think that what we see is, just as our relationship to others can affect our worship, our relationship with others could hinder our prayer. So going back to what Vic said, right, Matthew 5, 23, 24. So if you're offering your gift to the altar and there remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift, right? So we know that we have to have the right relationship with others before coming to worship. So when we think about prayer, I think it's only logical to understand that our relationship with others can also hinder our prayer life. So fundamentally, when we talk about, let's go to 1 John 4, 20 through 21. If anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother. So the question is, when we talk about our relationship with others, what do you think the underlying, if someone has issues with others, what do you think is the underlying problem with relationships? What's it all boil down to? Selfishness, communication, pride, love, right? All of these things can hinder the relationship that we have with other people. Think about it, right? You go to the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee's issue was pride. He thought he was much better than the tax collector. We talk about having problems with someone at the altar before you get to worship. Well, what might that problem be? It may be where you felt like you've been cheated or you had been wronged or whatever. The thing is that oftentimes when we really feel or we look at the relationship with others, it's nothing about them, but it's really about us, right? And how can we have an honest prayer, honest relationship with God if we still have these things of selfishness and these type of things within our heart, right? So sometimes that relationship with others, that is also something that kind of hinders our prayer life. Okay. Hopefully these will get you, I got these last two will get you talking. Everybody's quiet tonight. So if we look at Matthew 6:7, right? And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases that the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard by their many words. So we have this idea of vain repetitions. So let's talk about this. Do you think is Jesus telling us that it's wrong to pray the same thing more than once? No, because what did he do in the garden? We talked about this, right? He prayed how many times? 3. He went 3 times and he prayed. So the question is, it's not the repetition that's condemned, but it's the vain repetition. So the question is, what do you think that phrase, what does that phrase mean on vain repetitions?
I mean, just like the heartless filler phrases that we often throw into our prayers.
Do we have those?
Well, when I say heartless, I mean cold, right? They don't come from the heart quite as much as words that are spontaneous.
So I'm going to throw up 3 phrases, and if you've heard these, raise your hand. Missionaries on foreign soil. The sick and the afflicted. Ready recollection. Okay? What happens, I think, is we use phrases. To me, the vain repetition is when we use phrases over and over again, and we never go back and we think about their meaning. All right. Give you an example. My dad, whenever we had a prayer before the meal, I would guarantee you, I'd promise you that at some point he would say, thank you for our food, and let it go to the nourishment of our bodies and our bodies to your service. Okay. Well, when Cole was little and had a prayer before a meal, those were the words he said. And so I realized that my dad said them, and then I said them, and now my son was saying them, but he didn't know what, he didn't go back and know what that meaning was. And so I think we have a lot of times when we say things in our prayers, we put it in there, but we don't necessarily think about what exactly is that we're trying to say. We don't necessarily know the words to say, so we just put that in as a filler. Okay. Now, is that a hindrance?
Well, if you're not going to move forward with your understanding and your relationship with God and talking to Him, then yes, it is.
Yeah.
Because it's just like playing a recording or something, and which is what we could do. We could just record that, prayer, and just when it's time to pray, just turn that thing on, I mean, that's basically what you're doing.
Because oftentimes when we say one of these phrases, our mind is thinking about, hey, what am I going to do for lunch today? Or, hey, did I remember turning that coffee pot off? So sometimes we say these phrases, but our mind, it's kind of like, so those of you who are married, have you ever we're talking to, your spouse is talking to you, but if you just say, okay, and just kind of nod your head, that you'll be okay for a little bit. And then they ask you a question, and then they're like, what? You asked me a question, right? These things keep us off of that focus, right? It is, isn't it? So,
I find also that this applies to singing. We're singing words, we're not really thinking about what we're saying. It's just mindless singing.
And what does that tell us about our worship? It needs to be deliberate, right? We need to deliberately understand the words that we're singing, prayers that we say. But what do you think this means when we have public prayers? We'll talk first about if you're in the audience during a public prayer, then we'll talk again, we'll make a point of those who lead public prayers. So what effect does this have in our public prayer?
So when I was growing up, I had an uncle who would lead a prayer, and it was the same prayer every time. And the youth group or kids in the church would literally, you could say the prayer. I we were married, and he would start praying, and I would be saying the prayer. So, to me, it's distracting, because you weren't listening to the prayer itself. It was just so repetitious, and he'd been doing it for 30+ years, that it was like a joke.
Yeah.
And nobody took it serious. But now with that being said, though, he was willing to get up in front of people and do a prayer. He was a very shy person, so I get that to an extent. But it got to a point to where it was distracting.
You know, I think we always have to remember, so anyone who sits close to me, you know, I amen at the end of the prayer. I amen during someone's sermon or whatever. But I forget when Cole was probably 4 or 5 years old, if he heard somebody in the pulpit said in Jesus' name, he'd beat him to the amen, right? And so in some cases, it's good to know that repetition, right? But I think if we know what's coming and we're listening, then I think our mind wanders, right, from the actual purpose of prayer.
Well, we're talking about a public prayer, whether you're a teacher or, in a class or a minister or whoever, leading the public prayer, if you know you're going to do that, to me, it just seems that it would be a very wise thing to go to God before you do that and ask Him to enable you, to help you to share His thoughts, His, what is important and what needs to be said, what the people need to hear, it's getting up and saying a prayer is not just, doing a nursery rhyme in front of everybody. It's, it has a purpose, especially a public prayer. It's like a job. It's a service that you're doing for the Lord. And so I think if we, and I understand how it would be easy to be nervous or, if you weren't familiar with being in front of people and all that. But there again, pray for God's enabling. There's just so much where it helps you as the prayer and the people who are, praying with you. And I just think sometimes that isn't considered maybe as much as it should be.
And I think that's a great lead in to flip it to say, okay, those of us who lead public prayer, right? What should we strive to do?
Well, it's not a time to be teaching the audience or preaching a sermon. We're praying to God,
Mm-hmm.
and we're trying to lift our thoughts and our spirits up to Him
And our request.
and our request to Him. And sometimes, we get caught up in trying to explain the plan of salvation in a prayer, things like that. We don't need to do that.
Okay.
I know that some people might frown on this, but I don't have any problem with, so you don't fall into that repetition. If you aren't a public speaker and you write the prayer out, like I know people who have spent hours the night before because they didn't want to say the same phrases, so it just sounds like. And again, you can take that too far and try and preach a sermon. That's not what I mean either. But I think that's a very good way of saying what you want to say without, being empty, repeating words and that kind of stuff, and letting what you really want to get out.
So if any of you have led prayer in the last couple of years, Brandon does a wonderful job with suggesting, along with what our sermon would be, and leading the congregation that way in your prayer on the sheet that he sends out every Wednesday or so, Tuesday or Wednesday. Then he hands it out when we meet before class. It's just a suggestion. He's not telling anybody what. It's just a way to guide us in the way that we're fixing to hear a sermon about.
These three things are all good things that we need to be praying for, and we need to be included in our prayer. I think those of us who lead public prayer, we just can't fall into repeating those same phrases over and over again to where those in the audience know what's coming, right? There's other ways for us to pray for our missionaries. There's other ways for us to pray for those who are struggling within our congregation. There's other ways to pray for the speaker that instead of, Lord, open our hearts to hear what he's presenting to us, right? I think we need to make sure we don't fall into that. I love the nursery rhyme, that we don't fall into using those same phrases. I really think it's true when we get to the Lord's Supper, because I think oftentimes the prayer for the bread, the prayer for the cup, they're the same. Everybody uses the same words each week, right? So I think we have to, as leading in public prayer, I think we just have to be mindful of not getting, because I think what you were talking about, Jesus addressed earlier, right? Of people who just stand on the street corner and pray to be seen by men and to use a lot of words. It's not time for a sermon or a message. We just got to make sure that as we lead our brothers and sisters in prayer, that the topics or what we say, we don't just use those same words to where, it becomes, well, this is just this same nursery rhyme that gets done every week, right?
I would encourage us to, when people do pray and they do use these, that may be the best they can do.
Absolutely.
And so let's don't become judgmental just because we hear these phrases. Let's don't, in the middle of the prayer, be counting how many of these are they going to say. Let's focus. If they say that, then you're free in your mind to be expressing it in your own words, thoughts also.
And I think these, I think that's a good point. I think oftentimes these are as much on the hearer as they are on the one that's doing the speaking, right? So when someone, and when someone says our missionaries on foreign soil, first of all, we should know what foreign soil we have missionaries on. So in our minds, we should be thinking, we need to pray for those in Africa. We need to pray for those in Europe. We need to pray for those, right? So I think part of this, as Larry mentioned, is on the hearer to say, okay, hear the phrase, but let's make sure we understand the concept and not get caught up on just counting that.
And I think what Larry said too is, it's not a time for a soapbox either. And preach a sermon like this. When we were in Montgomery, there was one person that would get up specifically to lead prayer in the congregation. And a minimum his prayers were 8 minutes long. And so you've got to consider your audience. There's a lot of things. So for instance, like if we were to do a prayer here, an 8 minute prayer is not a big deal because nobody's standing. You don't have people who have issues and things like that. Where when you're in the congregation, you need to be considerate of those things because it is distracting to those people. They may not be able to be as much a part of the prayer as they could be if they didn't have to go through that. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I mean, just some of the best prayers I've heard have been 30-second prayers. Some other prayers I've heard 10 minutes long, but you need to consider the situation where you're at, what you're doing, and how to do that. And
the last thing I say, move to the last slide, right, is remember when we talk about these, we're talking about hindrances to our prayer life, right? If we're praying in private and we want to cover all the sick that's in our family, we don't want to wind up just saying, well, we'll just be with the sick and the afflicted, because we're at a private time with God where we can bring names before him, right? So I want to make sure we make a distinction that for me, these hindrances are not hindrances to our public prayers. They're hindrances to our private prayer, right? If we get into a habit of, I only got 5 minutes to pray, so I'm going to say all these things just to cover, right? We just got to make sure when we pray that we're not following a habit of doing those same words over and over again and not thinking, because you know what? And this is just Mike Baker, if I pray for the sick and the afflicted, and that's my prayer to be with the sick and the afflicted at Madison, to me, that means I don't know who's sick. I don't know who's afflicted. I haven't looked at, we do a great job of sending a prayer list out and giving names. And so we are to take the time to bring those before the Lord. All right, and then the last one is, I mentioned this earlier, Matthew 6:5-6. And when you pray, you must not be like hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and street corners and may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they shall have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room, shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So is Jesus saying, and I'm not talking about public prayer, I'm talking about private prayer, is he saying that we shouldn't say prayers in public? Because before COVID, I flew a lot. I would always say a prayer sitting on a plane, right? No, he's saying that the antidote to pride is not to pray to be seen by others, right? Even when we're praying in public, at an airport, for the flight or whatever, we need to pray in such a way that we're not doing it that someone says, oh, look at that guy, praying or things like that, of being able to be seen. So here's my question. I think this is my last one, is we'll compliment the preacher for a great message. Should we compliment the person who does a good job saying their prayer in public?
Yes, you should. But you should do that because the person leading the public prayer is responsible for bringing the needs and the wishes of the whole congregation before the Lord. And if they get what you need prayed for, you should let them know.
Yes. Somewhat. Yeah. I mean, I think anytime someone does a good job leading us in thought or whatever in our worship, that we should compliment and tell them a good job. What's the danger? And it's not to compliment them, but for those of us who lead in public worship, right? We got to make sure we're praying to bring things for the congregation and not to see how many compliments we get after, right?
Well, one thing I think that helps that, what I always try to do, is I try to tell them specifically how they helped me to worship better because of the way they dealt with a certain issue or whatever. And I think that also reminds them that it was about, our spiritual worship and not about them, but that they were able to, help me worship better.
So 3 quick things and close, right? Is prayer's not without its hindrances and dangers, right? If we get to a point where prayer is just a mindless thing we use to check off that I've prayed today, right? It always has to be that we're focused and this is our relationship and we're going before God. Oftentimes these things, they come from within ourselves, right? It's I like someone saying, hey, great job or whatever. And how do we overcome these problems? Well, we got to pray, right? Like we talked about last week, the lesson from James is no matter what's going on in your life, pray. Things are good, pray. Things are bad, no matter what it is, you always pray. All right. So your homework, if you don't already have time set aside for prayer, this week, try to set some time, the same time every day. Try to go a week at the same time, focused in prayer, okay? For next week, we're going to talk about praying for others. Is it important? How does it make us feel when we know someone's praying for us? And so what I'd like for you to do is to search and write down any Bible verse. We've talked about several that talk about prayer requests, what we should be praying for. And then on our last class on November 2nd, we're all going to generate a prayer list. And so if there's anybody or anyone that you want to include on that prayer list, just email me, michaelbaker411@gmail.com. And then, like I said, if I don't have anything meaningful in the subject line, you get deleted. So just put down their prayer class. And then you don't have to be specific. You don't have to necessarily give names or specific situation. But if there's anything that you want as a class for us to be included in a prayer, you can send me that email. All right. So next week, praying for others. Thank you. And y'all have a good rest of the week.